Good evening from Washington, D.C. Good morning to those of you joining us from Japan or Korea or elsewhere in the Western Pacific. And welcome to other participants and observers from all around the world. I'm Marcus Garlauskas, the director of the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative, IPSI, now celebrating its first year at the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. I'll be co-moderating and participating in today's virtual expert panel discussion on the risks of simultaneous conflicts in the Indo-Pacific, conducted by the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative and the Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology Open Laboratory for Emergent Strategies roles of the University of Tokyo. IPSI is a relatively new program at the Council, a little less than a year old, so many of you may not be familiar with us. We conduct an array of activities to inform and shape the strategies, plans, and policies of the United States and its allies and partners to address the most important rising security challenges in the Indo-Pacific. We produce written analysis and video content. We conduct tabletop exercises, and we engage with experts, key stakeholders, and the public in a range of ways to include tabletop exercises, travel to the region, small private discussions, and public events in virtual and hybrid formats. Considering the risks of simultaneous conflicts in the Indo-Pacific has really been a signature issue for IPSI, and this includes our report titled "The United States and its Allies Must Be Ready to Deter a Two-Front War and Nuclear Attacks in East Asia," which was the Atlantic Council website's most read in-depth research report of 2023, which I'm sure my team is tired of hearing me mention that. Convenings like this one are integral to the Scowcroft Center's broader mission of developing sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and the world. The center honors General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership and cooperation with allies and partners, and his dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. To learn more about IPSI, the Scowcroft Center, and the Atlantic Council, I encourage you to visit the Atlantic Council's website at atlanticcouncil.org. Joining us from our partner, the University of Tokyo roles, is Project Assistant Professor Yo Hinata Yamaguchi, who is also an IPSI non-resident senior fellow. He has quite a varied and impressive resume that continues to grow. And so I'm sure when I introduce him, I won't do justice to all of his activities. But I wanted to note that he previously served as a non-commissioned officer in Japan's Ground Self-Defense Force. He held positions at several universities, including Busan National University in Korea, the International Crisis Group Seoul Office, the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, the Embassy of Japan in Australia, and the Japan Foundation Sydney Language Center. But he hasn't just been collecting job titles. He's been tremendously productive. He's presented, published, and consulted on a wide variety of topics relating to defense and security, including a book on defense planning and readiness of North Korea called Armed to Rule. So we're honored to have him affiliated with us. We've got 2 hours set aside for the session. We'll start with a panel discussion moderated by Yo, where each panelist will make a brief, prepared presentation and field one question. I'll be the last panelist, and so then I'll switch to moderating a Q&A discussion with the rest of the panelists. This discussion will incorporate questions from our virtual audience. If you'd like to ask a question, you can enter askac.org into your web browser to reach the online form to let you ask your question. Now, before handing over to Yo to get us started and tell us a little bit more about roles, and then to introduce our other panelists, I want to emphasize that this event is conducted in accordance with the Atlantic Council's strict intellectual independence policy. And what you're going to hear is the individual's views, not those of their organizations, the Atlantic Council, our sponsors, or any government entity. So with that, Yo, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Marcus, and good morning, everyone from Japan. My name is Ryo Hinata Yamaguchi, Project Assistant Professor at the Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology at the University of Tokyo. It's my great honor to partner with my other affiliation, Atlantic Council, IPSI, for this joint webinar. And so I thank Marcus and IPSI team at the AC Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, IPSI, especially Emma, Kyoko, Lauren, and Catherine, and also, of course, the events team. So to talk a little bit about roles, the Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology, Open Laboratory for Emergent Strategies, of the University of Tokyo was established in 2020. So we're also a young organization, and is run by the Religion Global Security Division housed within the Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology. We're a new but fast-growing organization staffed with young experts with diverse expertise. So we cover a variety of issues ranging from hard security issues all the way to religion. And region-wise, we have specialists that work on the Indo-Pacific, Middle East, and also Europe. Rolls aims to serve as a university-based think tank that brings together experts not only from the academia but also government, media, corporate sectors. So we bring together a variety of experts with various backgrounds that bring to get that bring along sort of analysis and insights from various angles and perspectives. So we currently run a number of projects, including three subsidized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And within each of these projects, we have various working groups that again cover topics from security in the Pacific all the way to religion-related issues in the Middle East. And so this joint webinar is part of the Indo-Pacific Security Working Group initiative. And in fact, both Lauren and Songmin, who are also going to be speakers for today, are part of that working group. And we, do a lot of discussions on the variety of issues in the Indo-Pacific, ranging from alliance management issues all the way to deterrence issues and also threats posed by China and North Korea and so forth. And so we'll be bringing, more events and publications in the coming months and years to spice up the debates. So please stay tuned. If you just type in roles, the University of Tokyo, you should be able to find us there, and you can look at some more details about what we do. So again, it's great to be able to chair to sort of co-chair or moderate this session along with Marcus, who has been a great colleague of mine for many years, and obviously, all of us know that he's the director of the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative (IPSI), but he also served in the U.S. government for nearly 20 years and was appointed to the senior National Intelligence Service as National Intelligence Officer for North Korea and the National Intelligence Council from 2014 to 2020. So, and we also have, I'll introduce our fellow speakers later on, but we have Professor Sung Cho, and also and Lauren Gilbert. And so I think we have a great team here to talk about our various issues, relating to simultaneous conflicts in the Pacific. So that's it for me. And over to you, Marcus.
All right. Thanks, Yo. No, I really appreciate those remarks and giving a chance to share a little bit more about what we've been doing. And so, at this point, I think actually, why don't you go ahead and moderate the panel? I think we're ready to get started. Let's jump in.
Okay, so yeah, fantastic. So again, we have a great team of speakers here, and so it's a really tough task to me to sort of moderate what will be a very lively discussion. And so we're going to start with some framing remarks by each of us. And then after that, will be followed by discussion and also Q&A. And so to talk about simultaneous conflicts in the Pacific, I thought, as a first a speaker, I thought it'd be appropriate for me to sort of talk a little bit about how we should define or think about simultaneous conflicts first, and then we can talk about the specific cases regarding simultaneous conflicts, whether it be potential or the implications or whatnot. So, in terms of defining simultaneity, and we hear more and more discussions about this in recent years as tensions have grown in the Indo-Pacific. We are thinking a lot more about it, but we also often get lost in in terms of defining simultaneity. When we talk about simultaneous conflicts, obviously that's part of the many issues or the risks that we face. But there are many other aspects of simultaneity that we need to think about. That is threats, circumstances, and also, of course, conflict. We are already facing simultaneous issues already, in that we already face simultaneous threats posed by both China and North Korea, who are both sharpening their strategies and policies, and are also becoming more assertive as well. They're both modernizing their forces. So we see significant developments in both the PLA and KPA. And also we have to understand that when we talk about threats, we can't just focus on hardware aspects such as, guns and bombs, but we also have to think about other kinds of operations such as counter-stability operations and so forth. And so all up, we already see signs of hybrid warfare taking place in the in the Indo-Pacific by China and North Korea vis-a-vis Taiwan, South Korea, United States, and Japan. We also already face simultaneous gray zone situations, and this is something that has been I wouldn't like to say daily business, but it's something that has been going on for many, many years now, if not decades, where both China and North Korea are putting their strategies and policies into action to change the status quo in their favor. And although we might say that gray zone situations they fall short of walls, right, or the worst case scenarios, still, these are clear signs that deterrence has failed or at least failing. Okay. And so then we have simultaneous conflicts, which is really still just a potential at this point, right, in terms of armed conflicts, that is. But through my career, I've taken part in and designed a number of tabletop exercises concerning simultaneous conflicts in the Indo-Pacific. And although, we may think that such scenarios are just a portion of the constellation of scenarios out there, the risks, the findings have shown that, the risks are in fact more real than one may assume. And so we are here to talk about simultaneous conflicts, but we also have to note here that simultaneous contingencies or conflicts can come about in various forms. And so I can't go into every single sort of shape and size, but if I can sort of give a very gross summary, right, of what these two how to categorize them, I think we can put them into two broad categories, and that is one is planned, and the other one is sort of more coincidental. Both obviously pose significant threats, but we need to distinguish the nature of those two sort of categories. When it comes to planned simultaneous conflicts, for example, China and North Korea coordinate in some way to create conflicts in two areas to distract, disrupt, and weaken the U.S., Japan, and ROC cooperation mechanism or coordination mechanism. And so it's all in order to distract the two U.S. alliances in order for China and North Korea to be able to make their leverage effective. And although this is something that we can often talk about, China and North Korea, we have to understand that China and North Korea will need to do much careful planning, coordination, and calculations so that the simultaneous conflict can work in their way. And this certainly ain't easy, right? And so as a result of that, China and North Korea, they have a limited number of scenarios and missions that allow them to be effective in that regard. Under such circumstances, however, we can also see signs of such preparation, right, and coordination and so forth. So in some ways, if it's something that's planned, we may be able to prepare ourselves, to deter or to respond to any sort of measures taken by Beijing and Pyongyang.
And Taiwan conducts only one joint exercise at the national level named Hankwang per year. So this means that North Korea has 5 times more chances to use South Korea's exercise as an excuse to justify their military provocation. And fourth and lastly, a conflict on the Korean Peninsula can escalate much faster than Taiwan Strait because of South Korea's offensive military doctrine. So South Korea has developed a strategy called three-axis system since 2012. It highlights preemptive and retaliatory strike, including the leadership decapitation targeting Pyongyang. In contrast, Taiwan's strategy is defensive in nature. Taiwan's defense white paper publicly say that Taiwan's strategy will focus on PLA's, the enemy's most vulnerable cross Taiwan Strait facing phase. Taiwan's strategy does not involve preemptive strike against the PLA bases in Chinese mainland or retaliatory strike against the leadership in Pyongyang, as much as South Korea does against North Korea. So in conclusion, all these factors suggest that even if Kim Jong-un does not have any intention to start a major crisis, not to mention a war, but a limited attack on the South Korean territory or lives can quickly escalate even more than Kim Jong-un himself intended to in the first place. So accidental clash is more likely to happen on the Korean Peninsula, and crisis will escalate much faster than Taiwan Strait. Of course, I do not mean to underestimate China's military challenge in the Taiwan Strait. However, China's military challenge in Taiwan Strait is uncertain, but still stay within a predictable range, whereas North Korea's provocation at its chain reactions are certainly unpredictable. So I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you, Sungmin. And so Sungmin and I, we've been great friends for more than 10 years, and we've talked a lot about this topic over the years. And I remember, when I first met you, we talked about sort of North Korea and their actions towards South Korea, Yeonpyeong Island and Cheonan in 2010. And so my question sort of relates to that in that, it's a very simple question in that, so with North Korea, changing, so maybe we can debate, whether it's changing or not. But with North Korea's new tone towards South Korea, and also we see the string of other things such as the nuclear arms law and so forth in North Korea and so forth. Do you see the strategic end of North? Do you see that North Korea's strategic end, right? Do you think the end game has changed in some way, or do you think it's consistent with what they've always been practicing, right? And also, you talked about how you talked about North Korea's calculation here, right? I'm just wondering, what do you see are some of the key changes in the way they calculate, their actions or strategies or whatnot, since they've been able to sort of beef up their missile inventory over the last several years? I mean, do you see more confidence? Do you see any sort of changes in the way they sort of calculate things? I was wondering what you think about that, that point.
That's a lot of questions for 5
Yeah,
minutes,
I
but
know.
I'll do my best. So this announcement of abandoning unification policy, I read many experts relate that announcement to the possibility of provocation, but I relate that with other policies that Kim Jong-un has taken by far. So the Pyongyang has passed the laws to control the spread of South Korean influence within North Korea. For example, in 2021, North Korea passed a law to reject reactionary and then some ideology, so prevent South Korea political influence. And then 2022, they also passed a law to guarantee young North Koreans culture and public education. And then last year, North Korea also passed a law to protect the cultural language of Pyongyang to ban South Korean slang. And they intensify punishment for North Korean young generations exposure to South Korean pop culture. So I interpret that as there is a growing concern about South Korea's influence within North Korea. And then Kim Jong-un's decision to abandon unification implies to me that the concern reached the level that he has to take that extreme measure. If this abandonment policy is about influencing South Korea or US presidential election, or it is about justify North Korea's further aggression, or if Kim Jong-un is emboldened by Russia or China, he didn't have to announce abandon unification policy. We know that North Koreans are really creative in coming up with nasty words and then new rhetoric. But this announcing of unification policy is about domestic regime legitimacy. And then the question here is that if it is about domestic politics and regime legitimacy, we should anticipate different type of military provocation, not increase of military provocation. Increase of military provocation, we expect more missile shooting to the air or to the water that we know South Korean people that do not impact South Korean people's lives. But when there is a domestic challenge, North Korea will directly target South Korean territory and lives as much as 2010 Yeonpyeong Island, because experts generally agree they attack Yeonpyeong Island not because of election, not because of South Korea's military exercise. It was a defensive regular exercise. Experts agree it is because of the power transition from Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un to support Kim Jong-un's image as a hawkish leader. So if that interpretation, if we agree, and if we relate this lesson to today's observation that unification policy abandonment is about domestic politics, then we can expect similar type of provocation which directly targets South Korean territory and lives. And then South Korea is all ready to launch counterattack, including retaliatory attack.
Yeah, thank you. And just to go back to macro very quickly before we move to Lauren, you know, I think we should be careful about the phrase like North Korea giving up on unification. In that, when I read North Korean documents, and unfortunately, I've been working on North Korea for many, many years now. When they use the word unification, it's more of a peaceful gesture to say, look, we're going to unify through consensus. But when I read some of the recent documents from North Korea or statements from North Korea, they're saying that, well, if South Korea starts something, we're going to hammer them and or we're going to sort of bring them into our side, right, or under our control. And so, we still see North Korea saying, okay, look, armed conflict is really the only way in which you can solve the problems with South Korea. The problem, of course, is that, when a hammer is the only tool that you have, well, then everything looks like a nail. And so I think that's, I agree with you that, the tensions on the Korean Peninsula have gone really high. In fact, in some ways, maybe beyond what we saw in 2010. So we'll definitely come back to some of the points that you raised, Sungmin. But now let me move on to Lauren Gilbert, who's the Deputy Director of the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative, Skorkov Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. And I've been working with Lauren for a number of years now, through IPSI. It's really great to to hear from her insights. So Lauren, over to you.
Thank you so much. And it's a hard act to follow going after you two, but I'd like to talk about sort of also the definitions of simultaneity and the concerns related and challenges that come from it. So as you both mentioned, the security environment in the Indo-Pacific is becoming more complex day by day. And we have to continue to think about how this is affecting our deterrent policy, and our thinking needs to evolve on this consistently. However, we see the US and allied and partner countries have a tendency to focus almost myopically on one singular threat. So as mentioned earlier, in the case of the United States and Japan, in recent years, they've been much more focused on a contingency with the PRC, particularly with a Taiwan contingency scenario or a territorial dispute scenario and the like. And then many outside the Korean Peninsula have discounted the threat of a North Korean attack entirely, despite this being the main area of concern for both the ROK and especially US versus Korea. In spite of this, particularly the work we do at the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative, we've argued for the United States and its allies and partners to seriously consider and prepare for the potential of a simultaneous conflict in the Indo-Pacific. And like Rio was mentioning earlier, there tends to be an assumption that a simultaneous conflict would come about through a pre-coordination or a sense of trust or even brotherhood amongst countries. So as Rio noted, a planned conflict. And this in part is why so many experts and officials have discounted the potential for simultaneous conflict with the PRC and North Korea. However, we argue that there doesn't need to be trust or any prior intention for coordination, and that even this resurgence of the relationship between North Korea and the PRC is not a likely source of collusion. And through several studies that we've conducted, in which we had workshops and tabletop exercises, including government officials, military officials, and outside experts, we found it, like Sungmin was saying, much more likely for a conflict to expand horizontally and become a simultaneous conflict with both. Or as Leo noted, a coincidental conflict. And of course, these conflicts can occur at different levels of intensity with either country and might or might not even geographically overlap entirely. And so, for example, this could start with a US-PRC conflict with a Taiwan contingency turning into a limited war, which is likely to escalate horizontally in Poland and Korea, unless it ends extremely quickly and decisively. But even if the South Korean military and US forces Korea are initially left out, Beijing could encourage Pyongyang to escalate in order to tie down US and ROK forces. And whether or not Beijing does encourage Pyongyang, a US-PRC conflict would affect North Korea's escalation calculus and could prompt opportunistic or even preemptive aggression from North Korea. And we completely agree with Hong Min, and we find it to be much more likely that this stems from North Korea So if North Korea aggression triggers a counteroffensive by the US and South Korea, this will likely prompt the PRC to intervene to protect its interests in the case of a North Korean regime collapse. This would then likely spark a confrontation in the context of US-PRC rivalry, which could escalate to military conflict. And further, Beijing would likely be unwilling to risk or willing to risk a conflict to prevent Seoul and Washington from dictating the terms of Korea unification and result in a US-friendly democracy right on China's border. So with all of that to be said, we do find it highly unlikely for Pyongyang to seize an opportunity to launch a full-scale attack to forcefully, like Neil noted, reunify the Korean Peninsula. Rather than proceed with a full-out offensive, we predict the regime to seek to apply pressure to the ROK in the US in such a manner that wouldn't trigger a full-scale conflict, particularly immediately. Conversely, they'd likely begin with a more coercive action before an escalation cycle would then lead to war. And this war would not only be devastating, if not regime-ending, for North Korea, but has an overwhelming potential to go nuclear. And this concern could likely lead North Korea to exercise a limited nuclear attack in an attempt to bring the conflict to an end in favorable terms for the regime. And we define a limited nuclear attack as the employment of nuclear weapons for lethal, destructive, and/or electromagnetic effects on US and our allied personnel and assets, while remaining sufficiently limited in scope and scale to be only a fraction of the adversary's capabilities. And so looking at it in the current time, Pyongyang's regime is a rational actor and certainly knows that it would not survive an all-out nuclear exchange. Both the increasing capabilities and growing arsenal, the viability for limited nuclear use can only improve. And North Korea's increasing capability to conduct a limited nuclear demonstration or a tactical strike will give North Korea options that could undermine the US extended deterrent globally, even if the immediate US and allied response could prevent a catastrophe or a full-out conflict at the time. So though it's difficult to assess the likelihood of a limited nuclear attack being used, we can be more confident stating the huge risk in such an action. The strategic effects of even the smallest limited nuclear attack would almost certainly far exceed its direct physical and tactical effects. And over the long term, such a clear violation of the nuclear taboo and failure of deterrence would mean that the consequences of a limited nuclear attack in the Indo-Pacific would ripple uncontrollably. And it's with these concerns that we're working to break through these cognitive biases and the stovepiping that occurs when talking about simultaneous conflicts, to encourage the US and its allies and partners to consider and plan for this potentiality. But I'm sure I've gone over my 5 minutes, so I'll stop here.
Thank you, Lauren. Those points were fantastic. And again, we often talk about some North Korean calculations, and you're completely right that North Korea knows how to calculate, right? A problem is that, do we know how they calculate? And I think that's one of the key issues that we have to think about. And you're right that when it comes to whether it be North Korea or even China, that there's so two ways, right? One is that North Korea, China takes action when they know that they're fully prepared to achieve their goals, or they take action when they feel that it's really the only option that they have, like it's like now or never, right? And I think that's something that we can talk a little bit more about later on. But I want to my question to you is a little bit different from the one I asked Song Min. And I understand that you do a lot of, and I know that you do a lot of work on US Rock, US Japan Alliance and so forth. I was wondering, although I know this is a really hard question to sort of answer in the space of a few minutes, but what kinds of positive developments do you see in the US Rock Alliance or US Japan alliances vis-a-vis the problems that we're talking about, regarding simultaneous conflicts or simultaneous risks? I was wondering if you could, give a quick pitch on that, right? Do we see any sort of positive developments there? And in fact, well, what are also what are some of the outstanding problems that we have here? Because I thought that'd be, give us some good feed into sort of the discussions later on.
Of course, and you're right, that's pretty difficult to handle in 5 minutes, but I'll do my best. I think we actually have seen a lot of positive progress, particularly in the US ROK Alliance. We've seen the Nuclear Consultative Group, the Washington Declaration, showing a building partnership between the ROK and the US that is really becoming a full-fledged alliance beyond just security, even though that's still the sort of ironclad center of the alliance. And so we're seeing that growth in the discussions on what will be happening. And we've seen a large amount of new exercises happening that are even naming adversaries that has been sort of avoided in the past. And to be frank with both of our close allies in the Indo-Pacific, the ROK and Japan as well, have been speaking much more, if not directly, you can read between the lines to see the stronger stances being taken against aggression, particularly on the part of the PRC. And of course, Japan is in a quite precarious situation with just geographically, and so they've been, particularly the late former Prime Minister Abe was speaking quite heavily on the need for Japan to focus more on Taiwan. I think we've been seeing that, if not entirely as a unilateral opinion that we should focus more on Taiwan, it is being discussed much more heavily. And in the ROK with the Indo-Pacific strategy that was released a few months ago in 2023, we could see quite clearly that a lot of the sort of between lines in what they were saying is really standing up for the democracy and this really the sort of democratic values of the region and how it's important to stay that way. And then the last thing I want to talk about before I should turn it back to you, Ryo, is we've seen a lot of growth in trilateral. Japan, ROK, US, they've really been increasing a lot of diplomatic meetings. We've had meetings between secretaries, and we've really seen the growth in information sharing and diplomacy. And I think that's leading to a larger discussion in how we can handle simultaneous conflicts. Because if we're looking at it from a threat perception, of course, everyone sees the threat in a different way, and everyone has a different view of how large a threat is. It's quite clear that we can't separate these threats any longer. And so especially with real-time information sharing, with the Camp David Accords, I think we're really moving towards a Indo-Pacific alliance structure that's much more prepared and willing to humor the concept of a simultaneous conflict and move towards preparation. We still have a long way to go in creating contingency plans and working on issues such as stockpiling, et cetera, but I think we're really moving in a positive direction.
And thank you, Lauren. And completely agree with you on the points about building up the trilat and so development of that trilat framework. I think there's a lot going there. But again, like we always come back to our question about whether the glass is half full or half empty, right? And so I tend to think it's half full, like compared to what the situation was like in previous years. At the same time, I guess the outstanding issues or some of the questions that we may have about trilat is about sort of the future of the trilat. You talked about sort of more technical things that need to be addressed, but we also have to think about sort of the sustainability. And this can also often be swayed by politics in the three countries. So, Lauren, great points, and so we've now covered sort of the issues regarding North Korea and China, the threats they pose, and also the issues in terms of the U.S., Japan, ROC trilat. But now I want to turn to Marcus Garlaskas, who's the director of IPSI, and Marcus, you and I, we've talked about North Korea quite a lot over the years. So I was wondering, like, what you see, what kinds of changes you see and so forth. But also before that, let's talk about sort of simultaneous conflicts and, what your views there.
Thanks, Joe. I really appreciate the opportunity to partner with you on this event. And so the danger in being the last panelist on such a brilliant panel is that a lot has already been said. But there are a few things I'd like to pile on to and then expand on, and the implications, right? So I'm going to talk more about implications. But before I do that, I want to reemphasize I did not actually get a chance to preview Sungmin's comments. But I just found myself just completely, excited and invigorated to see someone else, independently making an argument that the conflict is more likely to start, unfortunately, on the Korean Peninsula than it is in the Taiwan Strait. And I will actually double down on that idea. And I will say, actually, a nuclear escalation is more likely to happen on the Korean Peninsula probably than any other place on the planet. I think people have been kind of sleeping on this risk, right? And so I've been quoted on this one before, so those of you who heard me speak won't find it shocking. But the probability of a limited nuclear attack, the scenario that Lauren was talking about, is very real in the event of a a Korean Peninsula contingency. And I'm not saying it's not possible with Taiwan. I'm not saying we shouldn't be worried about PRC aggression and coercion during toward Taiwan. But for all the reasons that Sungmin and Lauren laid out, I think we should be very worried not only about the potential for a conflict spiral because of North Korea's coercive approach, but the potential for that conflict spiral then to actually lead to a limited nuclear attack. So I just want to say that up front. I just have a few additional things that I wanted to bring to the forefront based on some of the analytic work we've been doing, some of the tabletop exercises. So just a few things here. And some of this again builds on what's already been said. Is I do think this whole question, that you raised about capacity challenges is spot on. And in particular, I think, or I would say we assessed with some pretty strong evidence that we're just not postured. And when I say posture, I mean the U.S. and its allies in terms of forces and footprints and agreements, including the command and control arrangements. We're just not postured well for a simultaneous conflict with the PRC and North Korea. To be fair, also not for a limited nuclear attack in the East Asian, in the Western Indo-Pacific region either. And part of the problem is that the cumulative and multiplicative difficulties of dealing with the potential for horizontal escalation in geographic areas, different geographic areas, different warfighting domains, along with the potential for that vertical escalation. And that vertical could be in terms of the intensity of non-nuclear or in terms of the intensity of nuclear. And so I think that ties into a little bit of what everyone's been saying is we just don't seem to be really ready for that sort of either geographic complexity or the really rapid escalation that we're more structured for a more deliberate set of contingencies rather than something that could be as complex and multifaceted as what we would probably see in reality when you really think about it. Now, to be fair, that's a little bit of human endeavors. You always going to have a little bit of oversimplification to make it boundable, but I think right now we're just not postured for that sort of complexity and intensity in the horizontal and vertical escalation. But I do want to sound a more positive note here, and that is, to your point, I think you kind of alluded to this idea, is that there is hope for intra-conflict deterrence. So even if the PRC is willing to go to war with the United States, or is certainly willing to go to war with Taiwan in a scenario where it invades Taiwan, it's not necessarily going to be eager to take on a whole range of countries in the region. And in particular, there's good reason to believe that the PRC would not want to have to fight the ROK and deal with U.S. forces based on the Korean Peninsula. And so I'm not saying that they wouldn't be willing to risk it, or that there aren't scenarios where they would go ahead and escalate to strike the ROK, to strike U.S. bases in Korea, but it's probably not something that they're eager to do. Similarly, North Korea is probably not eager, as Lauren pointed out, to get into a full-scale nuclear exchange with the United States. And so even though it may be hard to deter at lower ends of the conflict spectrum, and especially some of those gray zone things that you mentioned, I think that over the escalation and evolution of a conflict, as much complexity and challenge as it presents for us in the United States and our allies, in the region and around the world, it's also pretty dangerous for North Korea and for China. And so they may not be eager to enter into these sorts of scenarios either. Doesn't mean they won't, but it does mean that there is hope for deterrence, that we're not sort of on railroad tracks, that once the conflict starts, this is automatically going to happen. It's likely to happen for a lot of reasons that have already been talked about. Doesn't mean that we can't potentially deter it. And so thinking about intra-conflict deterrence, how to prevent or control that horizontal spread and that vertical spread, I think that's really key. And then another point I'd like to make that's, I think, really important is the whole issue, as Lauren mentioned, of cognitive and organizational biases that make it really hard to get the people thinking about simultaneous, and even in some cases be thinking about limited nuclear attack, thinking about these scenarios between a conventional war and a full-scale nuclear exchange of what happens if one or a few weapons get used, how would that actually play out? And so there's a tendency, because these problems are hard, whether it's simultaneity or, again, limited nuclear attack, that they often get pushed to the side And then also there's the organizational, boxes. U.S., for example, always the comment about, hey, we got the 4-star command in Korea that handles, USFK, the tri-commands there, UNC, CFC, and USFK handle the North Korea threat. Indo-Pacific handles the China threat. Stratcom takes care of the nuclear, and then okay, we'll all meet at the end of the day when the great victory is achieved. Being a little cynical here, but I think that's those cognitive those organizational constructs create cognitive stovepipes. Not that we don't have smart people trying to break those stovepipes down and think more broadly, but it's tough to break out of some of those constructs, is what we found. So just a few other thoughts here, as I wrap up my initial few minutes of comments, is I do think that that there's another element to this, is that we have to recognize that the risks of the simultaneity with the PRC and with the U.S. Compounds the existing difficulties that we would face when managing a nuclear and other escalation risks. And so at some point, you may have to actually accept the idea that we may have to fight on 2 fronts versus 2 adversaries, just because it becomes so difficult to fight that one fight while still keeping the other one deterred or at bay, that you're going to have to accept some risks and think about how do you resource those conflicts. And so I won't name names here, but there are some people who think that, hey, we can just focus on that one war with China. And the point is that one war with China might actually also involve North Korea, or at the very least the Korean Peninsula being pulled in. So even if China is your primary adversary, it doesn't mean that you can just kind of create a magical force field around Korea and keep it isolated from the conflict. Another couple of points, differing escalation imperatives that the PRC and North Korea have in a crisis, and their different capabilities really does mean that the escalation dynamics are different. I'm way more concerned about horizontal escalation across geography and domains from the PRC into the region, into cyber, into space, and these sorts of things. Then frankly, I am about the PRC making earlier nuclear use. On the other side of the equation, I am way more concerned about what North Korea, the incentives and their capability for a limited nuclear attack, than I am even necessarily about some of the other, cross-domain or regional escalation. Still would be a problem, but that incentive that North Korea has and their doctrine they're putting in place for early nuclear use, they've gone from what some had described as a no first use policy, which I think was an exaggeration, to use early and often policy, essentially in September 22. And I'm laughing here just to keep from crying, because it's really a scary scenario. The fact that North Koreans have put early nuclear use really at the forefront of their emerging doctrine, or at least their messaging. And then, of course, a couple other, final points here is we have to think about how quickly the priorities could shift in one of these scenarios where a conflict becomes simultaneous. And so, to be fair, the priority might be at the start of the conflict. We have to we the United States and a coalition of the willing have to defend Taiwan against PRC aggression. But if the conflict spreads to the Korean Peninsula, and there are artillery rounds falling into Seoul, and North Korea is threatening nuclear use, Taiwan may not be as overwhelming a priority as it may appear at the beginning. And then, of course, if North Korea uses a nuclear weapon, even though the conflict was potentially sparked in the Taiwan Strait, it must, much like the way that the First World War was sparked, in the Balkans. The Balkans was not the central strategic battleground and priority, of course, as the First World War unfolded, right? And so you don't want to make too much of historical metaphors and analogies, but it's important to keep that in mind. Just because it could start around Taiwan, even though I take Sungman's point, it might actually be Korea where it starts a major conflict. That you do have to consider how those priorities could rapidly shift as the conflict unfolds. Wars between great powers, as some of my friends have often reminded me, generally do not follow a predetermined path, and they generally don't end quickly, and they generally pull in a lot of additional geographic areas and a lot of additional resources that weren't intended at the beginning. And then a couple other, and I keep saying a couple other points, apologies, but there's just so much to unpack here. So I do think the concern that about how we deter this is very real, in that we're so focused, as Sungmin, I think in particular, alluded, on deterrence by punishment and the willingness to out-escalate the adversary, it's a very high-risk approach, right? Is that, and I'm not saying deterrence by punishment is something we should abandon, but I think it would make sense to focus more on deterrence by denial than this really heavy focus on deterrence by punishment, because frankly, the PRC or North Korea in some combination can call that bluff, and I do believe in some cases that it is a bit of a bluff in terms of, are we really willing to engage in sort of the level of intense conflict in some of these scenarios, just because there's a limited degree of aggression. I think there is going to be a desire to return to a recognizable status quo necessarily than in every possible scenario respond disproportionately to punish the adversary. I think we have to be realistic about that, and I think our adversary knows that. Let's not kid ourselves. And then lastly, and frankly, it almost doesn't matter, to be fair, what we think or what we intend. It's how credible is it to the adversary that we'll be willing to risk, say, a full-scale nuclear exchange in the region if just one nuclear weapon, say, is used in a tactical use at sea. And that's not something that we're comfortable with, but it's something that we have to consider. It's very hard to convince our adversary that we would follow through in all cases on the level of punishment that seems to be often getting pledged. And then lastly, I really think that the synchronization between allies and the informational shaping efforts are really key to dealing with all of these challenges, whether it's the gray zone challenge all the way up to the intra-conflict deterrence. That this is not something that the U.S. can do alone, or just one bilateral set of allies can do alone. So the point that Lauren made in the answer to her last question, the question that she got last about building an Indo-Pacific alliance structure, something that moves beyond just this traditional hub and spokes, with the U.S. being the hub and then the spokes to the U.S. allies in the Indo-Pacific. I think that's where we've got to head. We've got to move to a web. And a resilient web of interlocking relationships, alliances, partnerships to maintain deterrence and to be able to deal with these challenges, simultaneous limited nuclear attack, et cetera. So before we transition to me moderating the Q&A discussion, did you want to ask me a question, or shall we just transition into the moderated discussion?
Yeah, thank you, Marcus. Really great points. I do have a really geeky question to ask you. So we talked about North Korea, China, and then we also had discussions about the U.S. Alliances in Indo-Pacific, but some more technical things. So we talked about this before, but I was wondering, when you talk about the sort of greater risks on the Korean Peninsula, and how we are worried about North Korea using nuclear weapons and so forth. I was wondering how much of your concerns are tied to some of the capabilities of North Korea. We have North Korea not only building up their missiles inventory, but also C2. There seems to be developments there, and we also have to think about their ISR capabilities. And my concern is that the C4 ISR capabilities, or whatever it is in North Korea, is not developed to the point where has not, so it's still underdeveloped, and so therefore, as a result of that, they can make some miscalculations or misjudgments about things that can lead to some kind of conflict of some sort. So I was wondering if you can give some comments on that before we move into the moderated panel discussion.
Absolutely, yeah. So I am concerned that North Korea's capabilities are growing faster than their doctrine and their ability to really understand and control them. And I think the nuclear policies they adopted suggest that they're being perhaps a little bit premature and maybe even a little bit reckless in some of the things that they're putting out. And there's a logic behind it, but that doesn't mean that their risk calculus is taking into account all of the factors, right? So they can be rational, but perhaps overconfident and underinformed. And so I do think the potential for miscalculation with North Korea, of misjudging a quote unquote red line, which is a concept that's problematic for other reasons, but misjudgment is very real. But it's that combination of increasingly precise and capable conventional non-nuclear weapon systems, asymmetric capabilities, really unconventional, but things like cyber, drones, especially underwater drones, these sorts of things, combined with the tactical nuclear capabilities, that Hwasong-31 warhead that Kim Jong-un likes to show off, the smaller warhead, all these different systems they're claiming they can use it on, then that increasingly credible nuclear deterrent backstop, and then that support from Russia and China That all is a very dangerous mix that may get the North Koreans to believe that they could escalate quite a bit in a non-nuclear, maybe asymmetric, deniable sort of way, and then think that all those other capabilities I just talked about in the backing of Beijing and Moscow could protect them from the consequences. And I've written on this and spoken on this many times, but it's the waters off the west coast of Korea, frankly, where I'm most concerned about all this mix of dynamics that really fit together. That's just one place, just one example. You know, the North Koreans love to have these tactical surprises. But yeah, I do see the very real risk of miscalculation. Again, not this choice, you know, out of the gate of, hey, we're going to start a war with the United States and North Korea and we're going to win it, but it's thinking that they can keep the conflict limited, they can keep us off balance, they can deny responsibility and prevent a regime-ending response. That's what I'm concerned about.
Yeah, and those measures that the ones that you talked about just now, I mean, that requires a lot of precise calculation and decision making. And I feel that like in North Korea may have the hardware, right? So they've got their arms and legs, but you know their eyes and their brain may not be fully connected with the arms and legs. So that's that's some the key concerns that that came to mind as I listen to your points. So Marcus, so I think we start off here with some great framing remarks, and so I thought like we can now move into sort of the moderated panel discussion that's going to be moderated by you. So I'll hand it over to you.
All right, now I'm changing my hat from panelist to moderator. So this is a reminder to our virtual audience. If you'd like to ask a question, you can enter askac.org into your web browser to reach the online form to ask your questions. And certainly as the moderator, I'll have some of my own, and so we'll weave them together. Feel free to identify who is asking the question if you're comfortable, and I can share that. Or if you prefer to be anonymous, that's fine too. So let's get to it and see what we've got in our questions dashboard here. Wow, we have a lot of questions, folks. So I'll tell you right off the bat, we are not going to get to all of them, even in the hour that we have, I think. But it's very impressive the amount of response that we've had to this. But I think a good place to start is a very general question from an anonymous individual, and that's, how can we imagine different pathways to a simultaneous conflict? What different considerations might we focus on? And I think we touched on a little bit in the beginning, and you mentioned about how there are these these different variables, and these different ways you could get there, but we didn't really talk that much about the exact scenarios and kind of what is the pathway, even though we framed a little bit about some of the things that play in. So I'll ask each one of the panelists in turn, just if you could list some of the top considerations that lead you on a pathway to a simultaneous conflict. What are the things that we should be focusing on, whether it's how do we mitigate them, how do we understand them from a intelligence and warning standpoint. So I'm adding a little bit more context to what I think is really an excellent question to lead us off. So let's begin with this one. So we'll go in sequence again. We'll go with Yo, Sungmin, and then Lauren. So go ahead, Yo.
Okay, so obviously there are constellation scenarios and pathways to simultaneous conflicts. But to start with one that may sound a little soft, but can actually turn ugly, would be misinterpretation of one another's military exercises. I mean, that could be one. I feel like in some close areas, whether it be the Northern Limit Line, or East China Sea or Taiwan Straits, I feel that in the military exercises conducted by China and North Korea, have certainly upped in recent years. And also, we can't forget that China and North Korea are also sensitive about the military defense exercises that we also conduct on our side. So I think, Marcus, you talked about some misinterpretation and misjudgment. I feel is that we could have some misinterpretation, misjudgment about one of those military exercises that can lead to some conflict, right? That it's seemingly gray zone, but again, gray zone situations can often turn into sort of red situations. So that's one that just came to my mind.
All right. Thank you for that. Sungmin, over to you.
Yes. So as we have discussed a lot for the last 2 years, and with your team's great report and also Rio's summarization, if there is a contingency in Taiwan Strait, then there are generally two pathways. Then North Korea will intervene with its own provocation. One was pre-coordinated, and second was coincidental. So if Taiwan was, if PLA somehow started missile and air strike against Taiwanese mainland, that already create a major crisis. Although it will take some time that PLA to still launch amphibious attack, moving from missile and airstrike to amphibious attack that's a different story. It is still challenging for PLA to cross the ocean. So there is a stopping power of the water, but even to that level of crisis, that with the missile and airstrike, Kim Jong-un, with the coordination with Beijing or not, he may do something. Again, but more interesting question to me now is, well, not interesting, very important question to me now is, since I see Korean Peninsula has more chance of contingency now, the question is, what would Beijing do in Taiwan Strait if there is a contingency in Korean Peninsula, such as Yeonpyeong Island, the Yeonpyeong shelling again, and then escalation starts? Would Beijing do something, military action in the Taiwan Strait? I think my answer is no, because if Xi Jinping ever wants to take military actions against Taiwan, he would want to do that at the timing of his choice. But he would not want to be chosen about the timing by North Korea. So there are many reasons that he would hesitate, even actually intervene to control North Korea. Let me just quickly point out, I think experts generally agree if US and China ever go to military conflict or war, they would not fight somewhere in Latin America or somewhere in Africa. It would be one of 4 flashpoints: South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan Strait, or Korean Peninsula. Then Korean Peninsula is the only region, the only place that China does not claim territory. So Korean Peninsula is a little bit distinguished from, I mean, it has a room for negotiation, whereas it is very hard to negotiate for China to make concession on South China Sea, East China Sea, or Taiwan Strait. So for that reason, if there is a contingency on the Korean Peninsula, the expansion of horizontal crisis is less than the other case of contingency in Taiwan Strait, and North Korea would do something.
Sungmin, thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's very different, set of variables there. And I like how you characterize it. I think it's a very helpful construct. Before we go on, I didn't want to scare off our virtual audience. Please do put your questions into askac.org, and I'm going to weave them in as we go. And I noticed as I'm looking at the questions, I found some ways to group some of them together. So I do think we'll be able to get to additional questions. Because we do have, a good amount more time, but I am very impressed by the response. So please don't let my earlier comment discourage you. Please go to askac.org and put in your questions so you can get great answers like just what you just heard from Sungmin. So with that, Lauren, over to you. So some key considerations and variables again affecting the different pathways to simultaneous conflict.
I think this is a little on the nose, but I agreed so much with what Sungmin said. I want to sort of build on a little bit. I think a large perspective or a large issue that we can take, particularly in a simultaneous conflict led by North Korea, is North Korea's perspective of the support of the PRC. So, for example, according to the recent 2023 North Korean National Intelligence Estimate, North Korea is more likely to pursue an offensive strategy if it believes it can do so while retaining PRC support. And in our paper that we did that everyone so kindly mentioned, we actually graphed out the likely pathways for simultaneous conflict. And a large part of the North Korean conflict is how the PRC is interacting with North Korea. And the more concerned North Korea feels about its regime survival, and the more it feels supported by PRC, or if not supported, at least not confined by PRC, the more secure they feel in not moving forward with a more sort of kinetic action, such as a limited nuclear attack. And then in the part of the PRC, I think a lot of it is the US responses and how how much it appears that U.S. forces Korea are pulling into, how much it appears that the escalation is moving vertically in this scenario rather than horizontally. I think so. A lot of it, though a bit on the nose, is the perspectives of both the adversary and the, if not partner or ally in the situation, the person on the same side of the fence.
Lauren, thanks. That was great. And I want to pull on one of the threads though, that you laid out there so correctly and skillfully, is this connection between the simultaneity and limited nuclear use and how that ties to North Korea's potential comfort level with the situation. So you know, to kind of build on what you mentioned just in you know, thinking about different aspects of this, is that North Korea that on one hand feels insecure and not supported by China, or China's even turned against it, as you point out, you know, that could be a situation where North Korea resorts to nuclear use much earlier, right? But conversely, a scenario where North Korea feels very backed and very protected by the PRC could also embolden them, right? And so it's sort of, where's this happy medium, so to speak, or unhappy for North Korea medium, right? But there was something else that came up that I thought was very telling, is you could actually have a simultaneous conflict with the PRC in some of these scenarios where the PRC is not actually really on North Korea's side, China, you know, and is actually actively, we could have, it is not completely impossible that the PRC could be intervening in a way that the North Korean regime opposes, but also that the ROK-US alliance oppose. And so that they could be fighting their own two-front you know, conflict. So there's lots of different permutations, but then it all comes back to the fact that you're fighting in a peninsula where one of the actors' survival is at stake and has nuclear weapons. So anyway, I just sorry, I'm abusing a moderator privilege to pile on to your point. So I thought all three of these the responses were really helpful and thought-provoking. And so I want to shift now to a much more broad and philosophical almost question, and so I'll frame it in the beginning, and I'll say a few more words about it and give people a chance to think before they have to answer it. So this one is a certain degree of creativity, I think, to answer, but it's a great idea of discussion. Unfortunately, the person asked the question is anonymous, and so I would like to give them the credit because I think this is a great question. It's, simultaneity presents us with a great deal of challenges, but are there ways for us to turn the concept of simultaneity to our advantage? And I alluded to aspects of this a little bit earlier about how, of course, the PRC is not eager to fight, you know, multiple adversaries at the same time and deal with, you know, ROK and U.S. forces, you know, right there on Beijing's doorstep. But I do think this is something worth unpacking because, you know, and I don't want to steal anyone's thunder, so I'll stop now. But I do think it's a really important and interesting question, and one we should take some time on, because even though it's titled "The Risks," it's not just the risk to the U.S. and its allies, but also what are the risks to the PRC, to North Korea, maybe to other adversaries as well. So let's just go through the same sequence, and so we'll go to Yo first. So this, again, simultaneity presents us with a great deal of challenges, but are there ways for us to turn the concepts of simultaneity to our advantage? And you can hit that more broadly, but of course, I'd be really interested personally in how this applies to the Indo-Pacific region. So over to you.
Yeah, that's a great question, but it's probably one of the most difficult questions that I think I've encountered on this topic. So I think this goes back to the point that we made earlier, in that, you know, are there ways in which we can sort of turn the dilemma, you know, against China and North Korea? I think philosophically, conceptually, I mean, that could happen, but my concern is how we can actually do that in practice, right? Because we're obviously applying some kind of pressure, or we're sort of putting out a lot of factors to China and North Korea that things are not going to go their way, and that simultaneous conflict is going to be the worst case scenario for them, right? But when when we talked about sort of China and North Korea, you know, the level of coordination they have or the expectations they may have against one another, I'm actually not that. I actually think that China and North Korea may not always be on the same page with all this stuff, right?
Right.
And so when we think about that, right, they may interpret so the simultaneous risk, you know, for them, right, in different ways. In that North Korea may not feel it as much as, let's say, China does, right? Because China arguably would face more risk in terms of simultaneous conflict than North Korea does, right? So again, like I think conceptually, right? It's something that makes a lot of sense and something that we should definitely try to pursue. My concern is how we can actually put that into practice, not only in terms of our readiness, right, and strategies, but also more about, how we can actually affect the calculations of China and North Korea. I know I'm not sort of answering the question like, head on, but that's just something that came to my mind.
All right. Yeah, thank you. And I know this is a tough one. That's part of the reason why I enjoyed asking it. So I look forward to more conversation on this point. But I think that's a good place to start. And so Sungmin, you've had a little bit more time and you had the chance to hear what I had to say. So what are your thoughts about how we could potentially turn this concept of simultaneity to our advantage?
Well, if the question is about Beijing's concern about simultaneous crisis for their own interest, um, Beijing should be concerned as much as we are concerned about multiple crises because of their domestic problems. That China has faced a lot of domestic problems, especially economic ones. That Xi Jinping, according to Wall Street Journal, he asked to meet with all the U.S. business CEO first before he met with Biden. Of course, White House rejected that. Oh, you should meet with President Biden first before you meet with Elon Musk. And then Li Chang, Chinese Prime Minister, went to Davos, and he also emphasized China is a safe place for foreign business investment. So to that extent, Xi Jinping and leaders, they are seeking foreign engagement, continuation of foreign investment. So this is not really the best time that China will take risk in Taiwan Strait first. And also he has a good reason to be worried about combat readiness of PLA, given all these reports about corruption and the purge of the military leadership. So again, it is not the best time for China to take military action in Taiwan Strait. Then it is even more so on the Korean Peninsula. They would not want to be involved in another crisis when they want to delay any crisis of their own problem in the Taiwan Strait. And then from North Korea's perspective, historically, since 1992, Pyongyang lost confidence and trust in Beijing, especially when Beijing started to resume high-level talk with Washington and all the high official talk. So North Korea also has a good reason to be worried about Beijing. Beijing, what are you doing? Why are you talking with US? What are you talking about? So North Korea also has a good reason to be worried about Beijing's support, and that may be one motivation that he reached out to Russia. And then from Beijing's perspective, it is a repeat of the historical pattern when North Korea does not have a full confidence in Beijing's support. They reach out to Russia. Beijing is concerned about North Korea playing Russia against China. So overall, from Beijing's perspective, Beijing has a lot of reason to worry about simultaneous challenge as well. And I guess some Chinese leaders should be really stressed about that we in this session talk about all the simultaneous crises. Beijing Chinese leaders would be stressed that this is unfair because we are also worried about that, but they hope they have their own barrier that they cannot communicate their concern with us because of strategic competition.
That interesting points there, right? The complexities of these these different relationships and this whole the challenges in trust and communication among all these multiple actors introduces a lot of variables. And so before we go to Lauren, I just want to remind everyone who's watching, please go to askac.org if you have a question. Again, we have quite a number, but I can certainly weave some more in, I think, in the time that we have left. And so please do put in your questions. Again, you can be either anonymous or put your name there. And then now, Lauren, same question. So your thoughts on how simultaneity presents us with challenges, but are there ways to turn to the concept of simultaneity to our advantage?
Yes, listening to Sungmin, it actually brought me to a different direction than I was originally thinking, and that there are also the complexities of dealing, of course, with the relationship with Russia as well, but that also leads us into with the adversaries in the Indo-Pacific, particularly North Korea. We haven't seen as much an awareness of the threat in particularly Europe and our allies and partners there. It's only in recent years that we've seen NATO, we've seen France, we've seen other countries start talking seriously about an Indo-Pacific strategy. We've seen them talking about the actual concerns that if not North Korea, then the PRC can pose to world stability and nuclear deterrence worldwide. And so, although of course there would not be a large benefit to if we're having to face these two conflicts, I think it would be if nothing else, a bit of a wake-up call to our allies in Europe into the sort of necessity of focusing more on the Indo-Pacific and focusing on the security, not only as this sort of, it's in a distant area, we don't have to think about this as much, it's not directly tied to our security, but the necessity involved if a simultaneous conflict breaks out in the Indo-Pacific would lead to, I think, a much more serious consideration of the Indo-Pacific security architecture being vital to the global security architecture and deterrence worldwide, which might be a bit more of a larger scale answer that you were looking for, but it just Sungmin's answer just sort of brought me to thinking about that aspect as well.
No, I mean, I like the larger scope of the answer, and that was one of the reasons why I wanted to pull that question out at this point in the dialogue, was to kind of, pull back and look the big picture. And so it strikes me that, we were talking about simultaneity focused on the Indo-Pacific, and particularly focused on the threat from China and North Korea on that simultaneity. But if you want to flip it around the other way, then having to simultaneously deal with your interests coming under non-military or even military attack all over the globe. If you're the PRC's ability to project power in a real comprehensive way, I would say, and a global scale, is just not the same as the U.S. and its friends and allies around the world. And so that's to say that PRC can't reach out with cyber and various means, and it certainly exerts a great deal of economic influence globally. But as you point out, simultaneously having to deal with European countries, other allies and partners in the region, as a conflict expands and gets more intense, and the PRC is harming more and more countries' interests, that simultaneity could really come back on them. All the more reason, hopefully, that would reinforce deterrence, is that you don't want to be, if you're the PRC, facing global attacks on all of your interests in response to a miscalculated effort to try and militarily occupy Taiwan or start a conflict over disputed maritime territories, or by backing North Korea when North Korea gets itself into a mess that it can't extract itself from without nuclear weapons. So I think this is interesting.
Marcus?
Yeah, you want to jump in? Go ahead, Yo.
Yeah, so just listening to what Sungmin and Lauren just said, I think there's also another thing that we can think about here, is that given the scale of the risks that come from simultaneous conflicts of any sort, right? I think it's also presents an opportunity for the US, Japan, South Korea, and even Taiwan to expand and maybe even deepen its relations with some countries in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands as well. Again, like, when it might not turn into like a full-blown sort of alliance mechanism, but at least to raise awareness about the security issues that that we face as a region, not just like US and its partners. I think that's also another. I think it's also another thing. So, like, maybe it's not an opportunity per se in the way that we want it to be, but I thought it can also sort of start the momentum for some new developments in the region, that leads to sort of greater regional and international security.
Yeah, and I do think, sort of in general, part of the reason why we're doing these dialogues and doing this sort of analysis is to promote new thinking. I think that to your point, this idea of promoting new ways to see these challenges and how this can unfold is actually important, whether we're looking at the risks or the advantages. So this is one of the reasons, again, why I wanted to queue up that question. So I want to keep, though, there's some very specific questions that I want to get to as we go through that are focused on different aspects of this, but I'd like to keep it sort of at the regional and global level for just one more idea, one more question, and that is, what about the role of Russia in a conflict in the Indo-Pacific? Is there a potential for simultaneity with Russia? And again, we're thinking broadly here about simultaneity. Is this a possibility that Russia could initiate a conflict, get involved in the conflict directly, or is the Russian military, a presence and capabilities and their various other elements of power, is that a significant factor we should consider? And to be fair, this is something I've also asked myself, because we did purposely sort of assume away Russia when we did the big simultaneous conflicts report on China and North Korea, not because we weren't aware Russia could be a factor, but because of the complexity of the variables going on with at the time the aggression in Ukraine, sort of being unclear how this was going to play out, and certainly we didn't know that 2 years later, after we started the project, that the conflict would still be going on. And so who knew what paths it was going to take? But what about the Russia factor here? And so I'm going to skip around a little bit since you made a comment. I'll go to Sungmin first, then to you, and then back to Lauren to back clean up on this question. So the Russia factor in simultaneous, how should we be thinking about this? Is it something that's a real concern, or is it just sort of a potential sort of red herring? What do you think, Sungmin?
I think Russia will take a backseat, providing diplomatic support first, and then providing some weaponaries. But I cannot imagine that Russia military aircraft they fly together with the PLA aircraft and then fight against the US versus Korea at the same time. While Putin has his own war in Ukraine. Even if the war ends there and then he has some room to maneuver, but still East Asia is China's area of influence. PLA will take the action first, and then Russia may free riding somehow, as much as they did during the Korean War. And then I think free riding it may be a biggest motivation from Putin's perspective with limited support. But other than that, I don't see much more active involvement. Although I like to highlight that while the war is ongoing in Ukraine, Russia still conduct military exercise with the PLA in East Asia, surrounding Korean Peninsula or in the air of East China Sea. So it is interesting that China does not provide direct military support. Well, of course, they provide all the other critical support, but not direct military support. But Russia is conducting military exercise with China obviously at the request of China, which means that Russia's status may be reduced to junior partner to China. And if that's the case, then if there is a contingency in East Asia, China may pressure Russia to do something, but still Russia would just want to be free riding as much as possible.
All right, thanks, Sungmin. I'd like to go to Yo now on this one, and I also want to add sort of a thought here, is that I know that Japan does face a certain degree of military consideration of threat from from Russia because of the disputed territories, and also because of the fact that the Russian Far East military capabilities and their fleet there are really right there, so to speak, on Japan's doorstep. So what's your perspective on it?
Yeah, so at Rose, we actually have some colleagues that work on Russia, and we talk a lot about this issue. But when it comes to Russia's involvement in East Asia, I think that one is a capacity issue, right? That's one. And number two, in that Russia, I mean, their calculation would be like, what's in it for them, right? Unless unless the dagger is really pointing at Russia. So yes, we have the dispute islands issue, and there's been talk about, for example, if we have like a war breaking out between Russia and NATO, in that Russia could attack Japan, right? As we have a lot of US bases here and so forth. But that seems to be somewhat separate from, let's say, their potential involvement or whatever involvement with China and North Korea. And so it is a complex issue, but I mean, from a lot of people that I talked to, they said that it's hard to imagine Russia putting themselves on the line, right, to join fight with China and North Korea. And so that's that part. However, there are two things that I'm looking at right now. One is, how Russia is helping North Korea and maybe to some extent China in other ways, whether it be military technologies and so forth. We saw Kim Jong-un's visit to Russia last year, and he took along three kinds of like, well, maybe I should say species, right, of that sort of military clan. One is the policy and strategy makers. And second category will be the commanders, and third category people from the military industry. So obviously they're looking for some kind of comprehensive package to gain from Russia. So Russia obviously is helping North Korea in some way, although we will like to see the results later on. I think that's one thing that we should think about, not just about sort of Russia sort of intervening in some kind of simultaneous conflict. Another one is that we heard rumors going around the media and elsewhere about Russia conducting bilateral or trilateral military exercises with North Korea or North Korea and China, right? I think that's if that ever happens, I think that's something that we should watch for in whether the exercises in whatever they conduct are somewhat more ceremonial or something that so genuinely enhances the readiness of the three countries, right? And if it's latter, or what is the exercise sort of working on? Like, is it about the defense of North Korea or something else? I think that will sort of give a lot of hints or sort of indications about what Russia's involvement may be going forward, right? So that is for me.
Thanks for that. And Lauren, I think having you back clean up is a little unfair to you because I know they covered a lot of ground, but please like to hear your thoughts as well. And I think we'll go to you first on the next question.
I was about to say this is a tough one to follow. Mostly, I'm just going to agree with what everyone said. I think, in particular, I agree with the fact that it's a capacity issue, particularly on the part of Russia right now. With the continuing aggression against Ukraine, Russia's war against Ukraine, they simply are lacking in capabilities, as we know, and the capacity for them to move forward is just extremely difficult right now. But I agree with the view entirely on Russia providing support in other ways, especially with the consideration that we're seeing this sort of growing rapport between the autocracies, the arsenal of autocracies, I think some people are saying. And we can see some benefit from their point of view of having these, if not partners, like-minded nations surrounding them, though we usually use that for democratic countries. And so what we're seeing right now with China and Russia is providing non-lethal aid to the war effort, whether it's heavy machinery, whether it's information, et cetera. I think we're likely to see that sort of returned interest from Russia to North Korea, like we've been seeing on this end of it. But I don't think I can add much more to these answers.
No, thanks. Okay, so now what I'd like to do, I think these were your broader, like I said, almost philosophical questions about the larger aspects of simultaneity. But now I'd like to drill down into some specific aspects of this earlier conversation. Some of it overlaps with simultaneity, but it also deals with current events. There's a lot of questions here tying into things that are going on currently. So the overall theme is this, and this I'll go to you first on this, Lauren, because I know this is an area of great personal interest and study for you, is the trilateral security coordination that's been going on between the U.S., South Korea, and Japan. What do we think that looks like as there's a political change? Is it sustainable? How could it be sustainable? And there's obviously a lot of variables when you got three different democracies and two of them that have presidencies that have limited terms. I think it's it's something, it's an important question to answer, is that are we on this pathway where the trilateral security coordination is just going to continue to grow, or are we facing some rocks ahead, so to speak, anyway, I think you get the gist of the question. There's probably a lot of different ways you can take this because I know your depth on this question, but over to you, Lauren, and then we'll be followed by Sungmin and have Yo back clean up on that one.
No, you're so right when speaking on the change in politics and sort of leadership and how that affects trilateral security cooperation. In fact, I like to to make a little joke in that I was writing my master's thesis, 4 or 5 years ago on the deterioration of trilateral security cooperation, and now I'm writing more work on the improvement of trilateral security cooperation. So it really is a matter of time and leadership on how that moves forward. And I think we certainly will, if not to get too in depth on the domestic politics on any end. This will certainly be a change depending on particularly if we have a more isolationist government coming back into the United States that is sort of concerned about allied responses and cooperation amongst allies and support there. That's why but we can see with this concerning growth in US PRC rivalry, we've seen a lot more acknowledgement that US-ROK Japan trilateral cooperation is necessary, even if it's not from a security perspective, but from an economic, from people to people, even public goods when we're talking about pandemic response. I think that at this moment, we are at such a heyday of trilateral cooperation. I think it will take a significant amount of effort to walk it back to the point, we were at when we were at zero communication between Korea and Japan from a leadership level. However, I think that this is such an issue that we've seen going back and forth between governments, whether it be the US, Korea, or Japan, that it's really necessary that we start operationalizing just the bare minimum, essentially, of trilateral cooperation. Of course, we're very far from a mutual security treaty. We're very far from a formal alliance. However, operationalizing the sort of communication, particularly from a bottom-up level, I think is key to moving forward, even when we're facing such potential political upheaval. And I could talk about this for hours, so I should probably stop it there.
All right. Thanks, Lauren. Appreciate that. Over to you, Sungmin.
So the future of trilateral cooperation, I think there are goodwill not only at the leadership level but also at the public opinion level. That despite the look of domestic criticism about the Yoon government's bold improvement of its relationship with Japan, the policy direction is actually supported according to the survey. So I have a number here. So 2022 KINU, Korea Institute of National Unification Survey, which was done in May last year. So 52% of respondents, they agree with the statement that South Korea and Japan should form a military alliance against North Korea. And that number increased a little bit, 55%. They agree that South Korea and Japan should form a military alliance against China. If it is about either China or North Korea, 62% agree that South Korea and Japan should form an alliance. Of course, that number spikes when you sort out conservative, the support of Conservative Party. 76% agree that South Korea and Japan should form a military alliance. So overall, it seems like there is a slightly more between 50 and 60% of South Korean survey respondents, they support even closer military cooperation between South Korea and Japan. And based upon that public support, the government in Seoul, and I believe Japan too, they want to further institutionalize and then make sure that institutions survive the political leadership change. And then the following controversy is that institution would lose effect because in the end it is the political leader's choice whether to utilize institution or not. But the current focus of discussion is how to further institutionalize, regularize this trilateral cooperation mechanism.
Thanks, Sungmin. That was some very helpful perspective, and I'll tell you that those polls, I was not familiar with that, right? Because so many of the polls do focus on, confidence in U.S. deterrence and interest in nuclear weapons, and so that that polling, I think, is fascinating, and it's a bit of a counterpoint, frankly, to some of the conventional wisdom that the Korean people are really opposed to this idea fundamentally. There's certainly critics, right? But that's some fascinating polling, and coming from you, Sungmin, that means a lot to put that into context. So I appreciate that. And so we do want to get through more questions. So if we can shorten the answers a little bit, to be fair, I'll tighten up how we ask the questions. And so Yo, if we could go to you, your thoughts on the trilat, and then we can wrap this up and move to the next question.
Sure. Okay. So Lauren and Sungmin already nailed it regarding the political aspects. And I'm not so concerned about sort of the whole trilat thing being completely reversed. I'm also the other thing I'm worried about is that if we have change of government, right, that the trilat mechanism will become somewhat dormant and then fall behind in terms of the pace of the developments on the Korean Peninsula and elsewhere, right? And that they're not that creates capacity issues. I think one thing that we need to think about is that how to sort of make sure that the trilateral mechanism is not only sustainable but also relevant for all parties. That's something that we need to remind ourselves of constantly, and that means that we have to go beyond just, what we're doing right now regarding North Korea's nuclear threat, but also cyber, transport security, logistics, also safety of one another's citizens and so forth. We need to make sure that that the trial is making that is producing results, right? Not just enhancing deterrence. I think that's one thing we need to think about. The other one is how to sort of coordinate the two alliances, right? Or even bridge the two alliances in more sort of triangle form. And that means that we need to balance the priorities. So it can't just be about China, it can't just be about North Korea. It has to be about both, right? And again, it's about coordination, not just trying to integrate all three necessarily, right? Because we have different views and different perspectives, so we need to somehow bridge them and make sure that again the trilateral mechanism is relevant for all three partners. So I'll just end it there.
Yeah, a couple of really interesting ideas there. The idea that it's got to include both threats, basically, and arguably has to include simultaneity if you're thinking about a trilateral construct, but also this idea of coordination, it being the watchword. I think that's an interesting way to think about it. All right, so now let's go into a little bit of a speed round here and get through a little bit more clear-cut questions, and maybe these I want to ask the whole panel to respond to as we get more specific. So just a quick one here, and one of our viewers here, Philip Randazzo, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, was interested in hearing more about the difficulties in China-North Korea relations, and he pointed out that he thought they were like a brotherhood, and actually that was the word that Lauren used. It doesn't necessarily have to be a brotherhood, and so any quick response? Anyone want to volunteer to provide a little bit more context for our viewers on what has been going wrong and what has been problematic in China-North Korea relations? Any volunteers?
Take a quick first stab at that.
Okay, go ahead, Lauren.
Yes, I think that especially if you're not watching closely in China-North Korea relations, especially in the past couple of months, you can think that it's a happy sort of family brotherhood of authoritarian countries. But essentially, from a lot of what we've seen, North Korea is a bit of a liability to the PRC in a lot of ways, especially as they're trying to, as much as possible, not directly flaunt the different laws and rules and regulations internationally. So since North Korea is a bit of a wild card, and their constant nuclear testing and missile testing, et cetera, it's a bit of a wild card for China that, although in some fashion acts as a buffer of protection for the PRC, in a lot of other ways, it's its own liability, I think. And so with the constant pressure of the international community against China, saying you're the only one that can block North Korea from taking these actions, it's your responsibility to keep them in line as the sort of closest, if not ally, relation domestically or politically, I should say. It's a constant pressure on China, at least from what we're seeing from the outside.
Yeah.
Thanks, Lauren. Any quick adds from that, from Yo or someone? Go ahead, Yo.
Okay, yeah, so I completely agree with what Lauren said, but from North Korea's perspective, they'll also be concerned about China as well, in that, China takes up about 90+% of North Korea's external trade, right? So North Korea is extremely worried about Chinese influence. So when we look at China, North Korea, and also to some extent Russia, right, we have three countries that engage quite closely, right, and intimately when it comes to things where they're fully in line with one another. But on other things, they often sort of keep distance with one another. I think that's sort of one interesting aspect to that. So that China, North Korea, Russia triangle that's starting to emerge. And in fact, I also see that we see three sets of bilaterals that are quite separate from one another, right? And the other thing is that these three countries don't really work with some obligations like we do, like in terms of alliance and that. So I mean, we often talk about sort of, weddings and marriages and that, right? I don't think China and North Korea have gone to that level, right? They do sort of have an alliance, but it doesn't function in the same way as the alliance that we have, between US, Japan, US, ROC, and so forth. So I just end there.
Yeah,
All right.
I also
Go ahead.
yes, I also want to quickly point out the difference between alliance between democracies and alliance between non-democracies. In democracies, open society, we talk a lot about criticizing each other's ally and the problem of alliance. But in the end, that all reveals the problems of the alliance. And then somehow we make progress by making mistake and then breaching the differences. Whereas in non-democratic closed society, all this sense, the discussion about alliance, criticism of your ally is always censored because it's so sensitive to national security. So at the society level, they don't really understand each other, what are the issues, how serious the issue is. And it is all about the guessing of the top leadership. And Kim Jong-un is also one of the leaders, very hard to guess. And from Beijing's perspective, it is very hard to predict what Kim Jong-un would do. Suddenly reaching out to Washington, suddenly reaching out to Russia. Or if we look back, Germany and Russia's non-aggression pact during World War II, Hitler and Stalin, they promised not to attack each other, but the promise between non-democratic regimes is always very fragile to break. And then I think Kim Jong-un or China, Xi Jinping should be worried about each other's credentials for promise. And the one example is in 2017, at the peak of the crisis during the crisis between Washington and Pyongyang, the Chinese media, they directly criticize Kim Jong-un, also threatened not to renew the alliance treaty. And then Pyongyang also openly criticized Beijing as saying Beijing is dancing to the tune of other external powers. So they have a history of really their relationship reveal their true status. Until that point, we just don't know because of the information control.
Understood. That's a great point. Yeah, the character is quite different in relations between the totalitarian societies. Yeah. So now we're talking about the friction between North Korea and China, and the nuclear issue being one area of that friction. And so that actually leads to a interesting question that's been sitting in the you'll excuse the pun, queue for a while, from Lieutenant Colonel James McHugh, who's a visiting senior fellow with the Scowcroft Center's Forward Defense Program, who's very interested and knowledgeable on these issues. And so he's curious to hear more describing what we imagine as a North Korean limited nuclear strike, what it would look like, and then the Chinese reaction. And he adds a little context here. Would that reaction be different if there was direct China-U.S. combat? Or, would that U.S.-China combat lead China to be more or less accepting of North Korean nuclear employment? And so for this one, I'm just going to look at the screen and see if anyone wants to raise their hand to jump on this one first. And I know this one may be, for another pun, a little bit radioactive, right? I know a North Korean limited nuclear strike is is not something that we like to envision. But would anyone like to volunteer to go first, or I can pick somebody, but would definitely prefer to have a volunteer on this one. All right. So this probably tells you a little something about the complexity of dealing with this Colonel McHugh. So I'll posit a scenario. And then let's explore it a little bit. How about that? So imagine a North Korean limited nuclear strike where the alliance has conducted a counteroffensive because it's been attacked by the North Koreans, and alliance forces are moving across what used to be the demilitarized zone to go after the source of these North Korean attacks. A scenario that I think we can all imagine, very, very well kind of, publicized and explained that, that this could be the way a conflict can unfold. And so the North Koreans decide to do a nuclear strike on those forces coming across the DMZ as essentially, or the former DMZ, as Lauren posited. So if we start that as a limited nuclear strike, as our scenario, now can I get someone to volunteer of how they think this would lead to a Chinese reaction, and whether or not the U.S., China being in combat would affect how China would respond? Any thoughts on that? Okay, I see Yo is volunteering. Thank you. All right, go ahead, Yo.
So Marcus, I mean, this it's not really a comment, but really it's like a question to pile on to what you just talked about. So you talked about sort of the US and its allies marching into North Korea, right? Not just striking back at North Korea with missiles. I think that's going to be the one sort of variable, right, that will determine sort of China's response or China's involvement. Because like if it's striking back at North Korea to sort of hammer their missile bases or the capabilities to sort of deny sort of follow-on attacks, my feel is that that doesn't sort of mean that China will automatically jump in, right? However, if we're talking about sort of forces going into North Korea, that will set off a lot of alarms in China because, again, as we talked about earlier, right, China will then have to think about defending itself, right, from possible sort of North Korean collapse or North Korean defeat. So that's just like first thing that came to mind as I was listening to the scenario that you just made.
Yeah, no, and that's an interesting sort of variable to interject, is that whether or not there's combat between China and the U.S. May not be as important of a variable as what North Korea is responding to and how threatened the North Korean regime is, if I can paraphrase what you're saying. So I think that's interesting. Sungmin, I'd like to go to you and hear your thoughts on this as well. And I don't want to pile hypotheticals on hypotheticals, but you can change the scenario of the limited nuclear attack if you like, or provide some different context on this. But would like to hear your thoughts as well, and then we'll go to Lauren.
US-ROC alliance, they have an option to strike back with the US nuclear capability. But even before that, that requires some time because it is such a critical decision. Washington and Seoul need to take some time, really take that action or not. But in the meantime, I think it is South Korea's military doctrine now. I think many people may observe that the current South Korean defense minister, Shin Won-sik, his motto is 즉시 강력히 끝까지. If I interpret, no, it is actually codified in the joint statement between Shin Won-sik and then Secretary Austin. That means immediately, powerfully, and to the end. South Korea respond immediately, powerfully, and to the end. So if there is nuclear strike, South Korea will activate counterattack as much as it can, and then I believe it will include infiltration of special operations for leadership decapitation operation. If Washington opposed to that immediate operation, although that doctrine is codified in the joint statement, I think a US-ROC alliance can give China an option that whether US and ROC alliance will retaliate with nuclear capabilities or leadership decapitation, or China you'd better intervene and control or give up Kim Jong-un regime and then negotiate or toward the regime change in Pyongyang. But that may be my wishful thinking. I don't have any ground or evidence material to analyze toward that scenario.
Yeah, I appreciate the response and your point that the stated policy is essentially to bring an end to the regime, but you put it in very clear terms about the way the South Korea sees it to the end. That's a great point. All right, and let's go to Lauren, and don't feel obligated to give an extended answer given our limited time. But Lauren, any thoughts on this you want to add, or shall we move on to the next question?
No, just a sort of brief addition to what Sungmin was saying. I think it's certainly, we have a firm stance with our declaratory policy and from the alliance perspective. And I think the Chinese response would be heavily dependent on how threatened it feels its sovereignty, its territory is. And historically, we've seen China hasn't moved in to support, at least with its own forces, getting involved into the mix until it feels that there's some sort of concern about US infringement on its own territory, its own views of what its security involves. So I think that although the PRC would likely be hesitant, I think if it comes to a point in which they feel their own sort of sense of mortality in the situation, they would be forced to act at least in some sort of measure of support for North Korea, at least so the fact that North Korea doesn't completely fall. But that's all I wanted to add on to there.
Yeah, even if North Korea uses a nuclear weapon, as much as China may not like it, that at the end of the day, they don't want the regime to fall. I think that if I can pull that thread, that's an interesting argument, and one that I find pretty persuasive. So they may not like it, but that doesn't mean that they will necessarily abandon the regime in every scenario. All right, I think that was a very helpful discussion. And to be fair, Colonel McHugh, looking forward to talking more about this. This is something we explore more in the report, and honestly, we could probably have a whole hour-long discussion just on how the PRC would respond to various scenarios of nuclear use. But thanks for queuing up the question. I'd like to ask a really short one because it's been sitting in the queue for a long time, and I think we can answer it pretty briefly. I'm going to go to Yo with this one, since you've written this book on North Korea defense policy and readiness, Yo. So how sophisticated are the desktop and simulation exercises that the PRC and North Korea have? Are they able? I'm adding a little bit of subtext. This question comes from Charles Burhan. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing here. To characterize, a little bit of, can they simulate and walk through the things at the level of sophistication we're talking about? Do they have that as a tool? Just very interesting, interested to hear your thoughts on this, Yo, and certainly Sungmin or Lauren, if you have specific views on this, welcome to jump in very briefly as well, but we're about out of time.
Yep. So I believe that North Korea will be conducting variety. We're talking military tabletop exercises in North Korea, right? Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah. Basically, their ability to exercise and think about these sorts of things as well, if I understood the question correctly.
Yeah. Okay. So my guess is that North Korea does conduct tabletop exercises of various kinds, right? However, I'm not sure how far it goes beyond that. In terms of using findings or sort of results or whatever from the tabletop exercise and applying that to sort of the various units of the KPA. I think that's the sort of missing link within North Korea. Tabletop exercises between North Korea and China, right? I guess. I'll be surprised if it has never happened, but I'm not sure how regular they are, and whether they trust one another enough, right? Based on what we talked about earlier, to talk about some more sensitive issues such as regime security of North Korea and so forth, right? So I'm not sure about the depth of those exercises if China and North Korea ever conducts joint tabletop exercises. So I'll just leave it there.
Yo, thank you very much, and Sungmin or Lauren, if you want to weigh in, please go ahead and raise your hand. If not, we'll move to wrap up the conversation. All right, I wanted to get that in because that was a good, specific, interesting question as we look across the chessboard, so to speak, at our adversaries or challengers of how they're seeing this. So still had some great questions in the queue, but unfortunately, the ones that are remaining, we definitely don't have enough time to address the level of complexity and sophistication. But I think it's telling the fact that normally these events go for, maybe 75, 90 minutes. And we've been going for just about a full 2 hours, and we really had a great discussion and still plenty more on the table. So looking forward to future conversations and discussion. And so before I actually close out the session, Yo, as our co-sponsor and the co-chair and co-moderator of the discussion, I wanted to ask you if you had just very briefly any final thoughts for us or any additional closing remarks.
Yeah, well, thank you, Marcus. And I think one thing that we sort of got from the session today is that the risks on the Korean Peninsula are now higher than the risks in Taiwan Strait. And that is obviously concerning because, the reason why we said that is because of the way North Korea calculates, in compared to how China calculates. I think there's some other things that we could think about going forward is that when we talk about simultaneous conflicts, we often talk about the Korean Peninsula and Taiwan Straits, but there are also many other sort of areas in which simultaneity can sort of come to the fore, such as the South China Sea, right, and various other areas, right? And so the concern here is that it's not just about conflict in sort of two hotspots in Northeast Asia, but so the chain reaction that we can have throughout the Indo-Pacific. Also, again, like we talked about how, based on that conversation, I got the feel that simultaneous conflict may not come from sort of like a Big Bang kind of scenario, but rather a gray zone situation that sort of gets uglier and uglier, uglier, and then turns into a conflict that no one really planned but have to respond to, right? And so that's something that I think needs a lot more sort of study through tabletop exercise and various analysis. And again, I look forward to sort of getting this conversation going again in future. I want to thank the Land and Council, Kirkhoff Center for Security, Strategy and Security, and particularly the IPSI team for putting this event together.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks to you, to the University of Tokyo Rolls, and all the panelists for a really great discussion. I'd also like to thank Kyoko and Emma from the IPSI team for helping to put this event together. And then thanks also to Greg from the Atlantic Council's AV team and Tachovic from the AC Events team for making this possible, especially working late in DC area tonight. So that ends today's discussion, this session. But the dialogue in this issue did not begin tonight or today. And it's not going to stop here. We are going to continue to explore this question of the potential for simultaneous conflicts in the Indo-Pacific. It's a signature issue for the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative for the Atlantic Council, and I hope for University of Tokyo Rolls, for all of us. I think this is first of many conversations, but the reason why we're having these discussions is not because we want this to happen, but because we want to deter it, to be prepared for it, to keep the worst possible outcomes from happening. So we encourage continued engagement and questions on these issues, and we look forward to further discussions. Please check out the materials on our website as we read about this, and look forward to more events and more materials to come on this very important question. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.